The phone felt heavier than it should have. I sat in my car in the parking lot of the Millbrook Police Department, engine off, staring at the cracked screen of a cheap prepaid phone that didn't belong to me. A detective was already waiting inside. I knew that the moment I walked through those doors, nothing in my family would ever be the same again. But let me go back to the beginning. Because none of this started with a phone. It started with a pot roast. My wife, Carol, made the best pot roast in Millbrook, Ohio. She had a specific method, low and slow, in a cast-iron Dutch oven, rosemary from the little pot on the windowsill, a splash of red wine she always pretended she was pouring for herself first. When she passed 2 years ago, I told myself I would learn the recipe. I never did. Some things you're not supposed to replicate. You're just supposed to carry them. I am 63 years old. I retired from 31 years as a high school history teacher and department head at Jefferson High. I own my home outright, Carol, and I paid off the mortgage the year our son turned 18. I have a pension, a modest investment account, and about 2.5 acres of land in a quiet part of the county that my father left me. I am not a wealthy man by any measure that would matter to Wall Street, but by the measure of someone who grew up with very little, I have more than enough. My son is 34. He works in pharmaceutical sales, drives a company car, lives in a newer development on the east side of town with his wife and their 2 kids. My grandchildren are 7 and 9. I pick them up from school on Thursdays. Those Thursdays are the best part of my week. My daughter-in-law has always been polite to me. That is the most honest way I can put it. Polite. The kind of polite that has a ceiling. She calls me by my first name, which I never asked for. She texts me reminders about family events as though I might otherwise forget. She organizes. She plans. She is, in the words of my late wife said once in a low voice while helping me with dishes, a very efficient woman. I never had a reason to distrust her. I want to be clear about that. I had no reason. It was a Saturday in early March, my son's birthday. He turned 34 on a cold gray afternoon, and his wife had organized a dinner at my house, which I found a little unusual. They had a bigger kitchen, a newer dining table, more chairs, but she said the kids loved my backyard and that I had more space. I didn't think much of it. I made the pot roast as best I could. It wasn't Carol's, but nobody said so out loud, and I appreciated that. Dinner was fine. My grandchildren were loud and warm and told me about a frog they'd found near the creek. My son ate 2 plates and called it perfect, which was generous of him. His wife helped clear the table without being asked, which I noticed. After dessert, we all moved to the living room. The kids fell asleep on the couch before 8. By 9:30, my son was carrying them to the car. His wife gathered their bags and jackets by the front door. There was a flurry of coats and goodbyes and drive safe, and I closed the door and stood in the silence of my house and thought about how quickly a full room can become an empty one. I put the leftover pot roast in the fridge. I turned off the lights in the kitchen. I hung my own coat on the rack by the door and went to bed. The next morning, I woke before 6 the way I always do, made coffee, took my mug to the back porch, and watched the fog sitting low over the grass. At around 7, I went back inside to get my reading glasses from the coat pocket, because I keep them there out of habit, and when I put my hand in, I felt something that wasn't mine. It was small, light. A prepaid phone, the kind you buy at a gas station for $30. Still in one piece, but with a crack running diagonally across the screen. I turned it over in my hand. No case, no identifying marks. I set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it the way you look at something that's slightly wrong without being able to say why. My first thought was that one of the grandchildren had dropped it somehow. But they were 7 and 9, and this was not a child's phone. My second thought was that it had fallen out of a visitor's coat. Someone's coat had been hanging right next to mine. I pressed the power button. The screen lit up without a passcode. Whoever owned it hadn't locked it. I went to the contacts first, thinking I'd find a name. There were none. The text message folder had 2 conversations. One was a string of confirmation numbers that meant nothing to me. The other was a conversation between a number saved as S and the phone's owner, and the messages in that conversation stopped my heart cold. I want to read you some of what I saw, because I need you to understand why I stood in my kitchen for 4 minutes without moving. The most recent message, sent at 11:47 the previous night after they had left my house, read, "Dinner went fine. He seemed slower than last time, easier than I thought. The response from S. Good. Dr. Mendez already has the assessment template ready. We file by end of April, latest. Then, what about the land? S. Included. Once guardianship is established, we consolidate. The house too, eventually. And then, the one that made my hands shake, he won't fight it. He misses her too much. People like that don't fight. I set the phone down on the counter. I picked up my coffee mug, then set that down too. I walked to the back porch, stood in the cold without a jacket, and breathed. Before I explain what I found in those messages and what it meant legally, I want to ask you something. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Because wherever you are, I want you to imagine standing in the house you've lived in for 30 years, holding proof that someone who ate at your table the night before is planning to take it from you. Take all of it, the house, the land, your right to make your own decisions, your dignity. Tell me, what would you do? I went inside. I put on a second pot of coffee because the first had gone cold. I sat down at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, the same kind I used for 31 years of lesson plans, and I wrote down everything I had read, word for word, as best I could remember, timestamps included. Then I put the phone in a Ziploc bag from the kitchen drawer. I didn't know if that mattered legally. It felt right. I did not call my son. I called a man named Gerald, who has been my personal attorney for 22 years, and who I trust completely. It was a Sunday morning. He answered on the third ring. I told him what I'd found. I read him the messages. There was a long silence on his end. Don't touch anything else on that phone, he said. Don't confront anyone. Don't let on that you know a single thing. Are you listening to me? I said I was. This is elder financial abuse. If what you're describing is accurate, a fraudulent competency assessment, a plan to file for guardianship to seize assets, that is a felony in the state of Ohio. More than one felony, potentially. He told me to come to his office first thing Monday. He told me to sleep, if I could. He told me I'd done the right thing by calling him first. I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed and listened to the house settle the way it does in winter, and I thought about my son's face at dinner, how he'd eaten 2 plates, how he'd called the pot roast perfect, how he had kissed the top of my head when he said goodbye, the way he did sometimes, the way a son does, and I had felt grateful for it. I am not a man who cries easily. I come from a generation and a geography where that wasn't encouraged. But in the dark of my bedroom, on the side of the bed that had been mine for 30 years, I did cry, not for long, and not, I think, out of sadness, out of something older and harder to name. Monday morning I was in Gerald's office by 8. He had already done some research. He pulled out a notepad of his own. A physician named Mendez, he said. I ran the name. There's a Dr. Eduardo Mendez, who practices about 40 miles from here, geriatric medicine. Has done competency evaluations before, legitimate ones, but I want to know how your son knows him. I told him I had no idea. Here's what we're going to do, Gerald said. He had a way of speaking in those situations, calm, methodical, the way I imagine surgeons must be before an operation. We are going to the police, not the local precinct. I want to go to the county sheriff's elder abuse unit. They have a financial crimes division. I have a contact there. We bring the phone, your written notes, and we let them take it from here. I asked him what take it from here meant in practical terms. He looked at me steadily. It means you're going to have to be patient, and it means you're going to have to act normal. I told him I'd spent 31 years teaching 15-year-olds who didn't want to learn about the Missouri Compromise. I knew how to act normal. He almost smiled. We drove to the county sheriff's office together. I had the phone in the Ziploc bag in my jacket pocket. Gerald spoke to the woman at the front desk. We were brought to a side office and waited about 12 minutes before a detective came in. She introduced herself as Detective Okafor. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She shook my hand firmly and sat down and said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached into her desk drawer and produced an evidence bag. She asked me to place the Ziploc inside it. I did. She looked at the phone through the plastic. Then she looked at me. "You said the phone was in your coat pocket when you found it," she said. "Yes." "And your son's family was at your house the evening before?" "Yes." "And their coats were hanging near yours?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. We're going to need a few days to examine this device properly. In the meantime, I want to be very direct with you about what this appears to be." She folded her hands on the desk. "If a competency evaluation is obtained under false pretenses, if the doctor performing it is being paid or coerced to reach a predetermined conclusion, that's fraud. If guardianship is then established using that fraudulent evaluation to gain control of your assets, that escalates to elder financial abuse, which in Ohio carries serious criminal penalties, up to 8 years." She said it plainly, the way a doctor tells you a diagnosis. I appreciated that. She told me what Gerald had already told me. Don't confront anyone. Don't change your behavior. Continue to see your grandchildren on Thursdays. Continue to take your son's calls. Be exactly the man you have always been. Is there anything, and I want you to think carefully, anything you've noticed in the past few months that seemed off? Anyone asking questions about your finances, your property, your health? I sat with that question. About 6 weeks earlier, my son had taken me to lunch and asked, very casually, whether I'd thought about setting up a financial power of attorney. He framed it as something all people my age should have in place. He brought a pamphlet, which I remember thinking was odd. Who brings a pamphlet to lunch? I'd told him I already had documents in order through Gerald. He'd seemed not disappointed exactly, recalculating. And about a month before that, his wife had mentioned, over the phone, that she'd heard of a wonderful resource for people going through grief, something about memory and cognitive care. She said she'd read that grief could sometimes affect memory in older adults. She said it very gently. I thanked her and changed the subject and didn't think about it again until right then, sitting in Detective Okafor's office. I told her all of that. She wrote it down. It took 9 days. 9 days of answering my son's texts normally, of picking up my grandchildren on Thursday, of cooking dinner alone and watching the news and trying to read and mostly staring at pages without seeing them. 9 days of performing the life I had always lived. Except now it felt like a stage set, and I was the only one who knew it. Gerald called me on the 9th day. Detective Okafor's team had extracted the full message history from the phone. There were more messages than I had seen. The older ones had been partially deleted. But the forensic team recovered them. The plan, as it turned out, had been in motion for nearly 5 months. The messages confirmed contact with Dr. Mendez. They confirmed specific language my son had intended to use in the guardianship filing language, describing me as increasingly confused, unable to manage finances independently, showing signs of cognitive decline consistent with early-stage dementia, none of which was remotely true. My last physical had been 4 months prior. My doctor had noted I was in excellent health for my age. There was one message that Detective Okafor read to me over the phone, and I want to share it with you now. It was from my son to S. It said, "He still trusts me completely. That's the advantage. He's never going to see it coming." I sat with that for a moment before I could respond to Detective Okafor. She told me they were ready to move, but they needed one more piece, something on record, something irrefutable. They asked if I would be willing to wear a wire at a family gathering. I said yes before she finished the sentence. We chose a Sunday. I called my son and suggested we have brunch at my house. I said I'd been feeling a bit lonely since Carol's birthday had passed, which was true, and that I wanted to see the grandchildren. He agreed immediately. His wife said they'd bring pastries. I want to tell you something about that morning, before they arrived. I stood in my kitchen at 7 a.m., and I made coffee, and I looked out at the backyard at the 2.5 acres. The old oak tree my father planted, the garden beds Carol had tended for 20 years, the tire swing I had hung for my son when he was 7 years old, the same one my grandchildren now used. I stood there and I memorized it, not because I thought I might lose it. I already knew I wouldn't. But because I wanted to remember what it felt like to stand there knowing what was coming, knowing that I had held myself together for 9 days, knowing that in a few hours it would be over. A detective from the county was parked 2 houses down. Another was in a car around the corner. Gerald was at his house, available by phone. The device I was wearing was so small I forgot it was there after 10 minutes. My son arrived at 10:15. His wife carried the pastries. The grandchildren ran to me the way they always do, arms wide, and I held them for just a second longer than usual, which they didn't notice, but I did. Brunch was ordinary. We talked about the kids' school, about a road project near their neighborhood, about a movie someone had seen, His wife refilled the coffee. Everything was surface and warmth. It happened when the children went outside to the backyard. My son looked at his wife, and something passed between them, a glance I had seen 100 times without understanding, and then he turned to me with an expression I can only describe as rehearsed gentleness. "Dad," he said, "we've been wanting to talk to you about something." I set down my coffee cup. He told me they were worried. He said he'd noticed I seemed to be forgetting things more often. He mentioned the pamphlet incident, the cognitive care resources his wife had suggested. He said that it was nothing to be ashamed of, that it happened to a lot of people, especially after a loss like Carol. He said he'd spoken to a doctor, a specialist, who could do a simple evaluation, just to get a baseline. And he said that in the meantime, it might make sense to revisit how I was managing my finances, my property, just to make sure everything was protected. He said all of it in the voice I had heard him use since he was a teenager, slightly too reasonable, slightly too prepared. The voice that meant he had practiced. His wife added that they only wanted what was best for me, that family looked out for each other, that I didn't have to do anything alone. I looked at both of them. I thought about the pot roast. I thought about the tire swing. I said, "I appreciate you both saying that. I really do." And then I said, "Before we go any further, I should let you know there are 2 detectives from the county elder abuse unit outside, and the last 9 days of your communications have been examined by law enforcement. So I want you to think very carefully about what you say next." The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat through, and I have sat through a lot of silences in my life. My son's face did something I don't have words for. It collapsed and reassembled in the space of about 3 seconds, moving through disbelief and then something like calculation and then something I can only call exposure, the look of a person whose private self has been suddenly made visible. His wife stood up. She said something I won't repeat here. The knock at the front door came about 45 seconds after that. Detective Okafor conducted herself with remarkable professionalism. She was calm. She explained their rights. She explained the nature of the investigation. There was no drama, no raised voices, no scene that my grandchildren, playing on the tire swing in the back, could hear or see. My grandchildren were brought inside by one of the other officers, a young woman who was very kind and who kept them occupied with a card game in the kitchen while the adults dealt with what was happening in the living room. They were not arrested that day. The investigation took several more weeks. Dr. Mendez, when interviewed, initially claimed his involvement was minor, that he had only agreed to conduct an evaluation, not to predetermine the result. But the messages recovered from the phone told a different story, and when his attorney reviewed the evidence, his cooperation became considerably more forthcoming. The filing for guardianship, which had been drafted, I saw it later, pages long, full of language I did not recognize, as describing me was never submitted. The land is mine. The house is mine. The accounts are mine. My right to make my own decisions remains, as it should be, entirely my own. I want to tell you what I didn't expect. I expected anger. I have enough of it. But what surprised me was what came before the anger, a kind of grief I hadn't prepared for, different from the grief of losing Carol. That grief had weight and texture, I understood. This grief was thinner, stranger. The grief of discovering that something you believed in was never quite what you thought. I have 2 grandchildren who still come to me on Thursdays. They still tell me about frogs near the creek. They still fall asleep in the same living room where their parents sat and planned something I cannot fully comprehend. None of that is their fault. None of that changes what they are to me. There is a version of this story where I say I've forgiven everyone, where I end with something tidy about the human capacity for grace. I am not there yet. I may not get there. I am 63 years old and I know my own limitations. What I know is this. On the morning I found that phone, I had a choice. I could have called my son in a panic. I could have confronted his wife in the driveway. I could have let it hollow me out, the way betrayal will if you let it. Instead, I called Gerald. I went to the police. I sat in my kitchen for 9 days and I watched the backyard and I drank my coffee and I waited. My father used to say that a man's character is what he does with the time between finding out and acting on it. He wasn't a philosophical man by nature. He was a farmer. Mostly quiet, but he said things like that occasionally. And they stayed. Carol used to say something different. She'd say, "You survived 31 years of teenagers who didn't want to be there. You can survive anything." I think she was right. as she usually was. I still haven't learned her pot roast recipe. Her handwritten card is in the kitchen drawer, right where she left it, under the takeout menus and the extra batteries. I keep meaning to try it. I think I'm almost ready. I gave my son every advantage I had. I paid for his education. I co-signed his first car. I held his children the day each of them were born, and I meant every word I ever said to him about being proud. But there are things a father cannot give a child, no matter how much he wants to. Things that have to grow from somewhere inside the person themselves. A conscience, a sense of enough, the understanding that love is not a transaction. Those things I could not give him. And this house, this land, this life, those things I did not. If any part of what I've shared today has stayed with you, if you've ever felt what it means to have your trust used against you, I hope you'll take one thing away. Document everything. Call someone you trust before you do anything else. And never, for a single moment, let anyone convince you that your silence is the same as your consent. Thank you for being here with me today. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm grateful you listened.